Get that mutt out of here. Can't you read the signs? No pets." Officer Miller's voice, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the otherwise quiet hum of the small protest. His polished boot nudged with deliberate, contemptuous force the flank of the golden retriever lying patiently at the old man's feet. The dog, Duke, let out a soft, pained whimper, pressing closer to his companion. The old man, Elias Thorne, didn't flinch, didn't shout. He simply looked up, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, clouded with a weariness that seemed ancient, yet holding a spark of something unyielding deep within their depths, something the young, swaggering officer couldn't begin to comprehend. This gathering wasn't just another disgruntled crowd. For Elias, it was a last stand, for dignity, for memory, for brothers in arms forgotten. And Elias, though his body stooped and his hands trembled slightly, was a fortress that had weathered far greater storms than a young policeman's scorn. He would not break. Not now. Not ever. If you believe that true strength often lies in quiet, resilience, and that every soul deserves respect, comment honor below this story. Elias Thorne was a silhouette against the vibrant, sometimes harsh tapestry of modern life in the town of Harmony Creek. Most days he was just another elderly man easily overlooked. His presence was as unassuming as the faded olive-drab jacket he wore, regardless of the season. Its comfortable sag over his thin shoulders spoke of countless years, perhaps of hardship, but never hinted at the steel that once lined his spine, nor the weight of command he once carried. Few in Harmony Creek, a town that prided itself on its peaceful ordinariness, knew that beneath the quiet exterior, the gentle, almost hesitant shuffle in his walk, was a man sculpted by the unforgiving. Fires of conflict, Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, Green Beret, recipient of commendations that now lay unvisited and unremarked in a simple wooden box beneath his bed, alongside a folded flag and a handful of tarnished dog tags that weren't his own. His life now was a study in quietude, a stark contrast to the cacophony of his past. Duke, his golden retriever service dog, was his anchor, a warm, breathing presence that helped him navigate the labyrinth of civilian life, a world that often felt too loud, too jarring, too disconnected from the silent, lethal intensity that had once been his daily bread. Duke, with his intuitive understanding and steady companionship, was more than a service animal. He was a confidant, a therapist, a living, breathing piece of peace in Elias's often turbulent inner world. The protest today, a modest gathering of mostly older veterans and a few concerned townsfolk, was against the proposed budget-driven closure of the local Veteran Support Center. For Elias, and for many like him, the center wasn't just a building, it was a sanctuary, a place of understanding, a lifeline in a world that too often forgot their sacrifices. He had felt an undeniable compulsion to be here, not for himself, but for the others, for the memory of those who couldn't stand for themselves. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke, but an undercurrent of anxiety rippled through the small crowd as they held their hand-painted signs, their faces etched with concern. The protest had been peaceful, almost somber, a collection of grizzled faces and quiet resolve. Officer Miller, young, ambitious, and radiating an impatient energy, and his even younger partner, Officer Davies, had been assigned crowd control. Davies looked nervous, his eyes darting around, while Miller seemed to view the assignment as beneath him. His lips curled in a perpetual near sneer as he scanned the small assembly of mostly elderly men and women. He seemed to fixate on Elias almost immediately, perhaps because Elias was one of the quietest, his frailty making him an easy target for casual dominance. "Hey, Pops," Miller had called out earlier, his voice laced with derision. "You sure that dog's even a real service animal? Looks like a pampered pet to me. People do anything for attention these days." He sauntered closer, baton tapping rhythmically against his thigh. Elias, without raising his voice, had tried to explain. He's a fully certified medical service dog officer, helps with my PTSD. He gestured to Duke's clearly marked vest, which bore the official insignia, Miller. Merely scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand. PTSD? Sure. Everyone's got something these days. Probably just an excuse to bring your furry friend everywhere. Davies shifted uncomfortably beside his partner, muttering something about protocol. But Miller ignored him. The officer then instructed Elias to move from the edge of the sidewalk, claiming he was obstructing pedestrian traffic, though the walkway was nearly empty. When Elias complied, shuffling a few feet away, Miller then complained he was too close to the roadway. Each interaction was a small, deliberate erosion of dignity, a casual display of power that Elias absorbed with a stoic, unsettling calm. Other protesters watched, a mixture of unease and quiet anger in their eyes, but the presence of uniformed authority kept their objections muted, transformed into simmering resentment. The air grew thick with unspoken frustration. Officer Miller, perhaps sensing the crowd's restrained hostility, seemed to become more assertive, his posture more aggressive, his voice louder. He paced before the line of protesters, his gaze sweeping over them like a bored predator. Elias, meanwhile, had retreated further into himself, his focus narrowing to Duke, who lay steadfastly by his side, occasionally nudging his hand with Ihi's wet nose as if sensing his master's internal struggle. Inside Elias, old ghosts stirred. The scent of exhaust fumes from a passing bus momentarily transported him to a dust-choked road. The rumble of engines, a prelude to chaos. He closed his eyes just for a second, breathing deeply, anchoring himself to Duke's warmth. He had faced down enemy platoons, endured interrogations, survived ambushes where death was a palpable entity breathing down his neck. This was just a boy in a uniform, drunk on a thimbleful of authority. But the disrespect stung in a different way, a deeper way, for it was aimed not just at him, but at Duke, his loyal companion, his lifesaver. The final provocation came, swiftly, brutally. As Miller swaggered past again, Duke, perhaps sensing the escalating tension or reacting to a sudden jerky movement from the officer, let out a low, almost inaudible growl, a mere rumble in his chest. It was enough. Oh, so. The mutt's got a temper now, does he? Miller sneered, and then, with a shocking lack of hesitation, his boot shot out. Not a nudge this time, but a sharp, deliberate kick to Duke's ribs. The dog yelped, a piercing sound of pain and surprise, scrambling backward, tail tucked, eyes wide with fear, trying to hide behind Elias's legs. A collective gasp rippled through the protesters. Several older veterans took an involuntary step forward, their faces hardening. Elias didn't shout. He didn't lunge. The storm in his eyes intensified, but his movements were slow, deliberate. He knelt, his old knees, protesting, and gathered Duke into his arms, stroking the whimpering dog, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. His face, however, was a mask of glacial composure, his silence more potent, more accusatory than any shout could have been. The world seemed to shrink to the space between him and his injured friend. The murmurs of the crowd, Miller's smug justification, all fading into a dull roar. Officer Davies, his face pale, finally found his voice, a stark contrast to Miller's bravado. "Miller, ease up, man. He's an old guy. It's just a dog. Let's just ask them to move along, okay?" He looked genuinely distressed, glancing nervously at the crowd, then at Elias, who was now whispering soothing words to Duke, his broad back turned to the officers. But Miller, fueled by the adrenaline of his petty power play and misinterpreting Elias's silence as submission, doubled down. He puffed out his chest, his voice dripping with scorn. This old troublemaker needs to learn some respect for the badge, and his aggressive animal needs to be impounded. He tapped his notepad with a flourish. "What's your name, old man?" so I can write you up for public nuisance, creating a disturbance, and harboring a dangerous animal." For a long moment Elias didn't respond. He continued to comfort Duke, checking him for injury. Then, slowly, achingly, he rose to his feet. The stoop in his shoulders seemed less pronounced now, a subtle shift in his posture that went unnoticed by Miller but sent a shiver down Davies's spine. When Elias finally turned, his eyes, though still filled with a deep sorrow for his dog, held a new light. A flicker of an old fire. His voice, when he spoke, was low, devoid of heat. Yet it cut through the tense atmosphere with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Thorne," he stated, the single word resonating with an unexpected gravity. "Elias Thorne." A pause. Then, almost an afterthought. "Call sign Ghost." He looked down at Duke, who licked his hand. "And this," he added, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "is Duke. He's a decorated combat service veteran himself, in a manner of speaking. He's saved my life more times than you've probably had hot dinners, officer." Miller, however, was incapable of recognizing the shift, the quiet authority. He let out a bark of derisive laughter. "Sergeant Major of what? The local bingo hall? Ghost? Ooh, spooky. You're trying to intimidate an officer of the law with fairy tales, Grandpa? That's rich." Just as Miller opened his mouth to deliver another sarcastic barb, a low guttural rumble began to permeate the air. It started subtly, a vibration, felt more than heard, growing steadily, insistently, until it drowned out the traffic noise and the nervous chatter of the onlookers. Heads began to turn, confusion and apprehension dawning on the faces in the square. The sound was unmistakable, deeply resonant, the powerful engines of heavy military vehicles. Down the main thoroughfare, a convoy, imposing and undeniably official, came into view. 3 National Guard Humvees, their desert tan paint stark against the autumnal colors of Harmony Creek, followed by a larger troop transport truck, rolled with disciplined precision toward the small-town square. They weren't moving with sirens, blaring or lights flashing, but with a purposeful, inexorable advance that commanded immediate attention. The lead Humvee, flying a small pennant denoting a command vehicle, pulled to a smooth halt directly opposite the protest, its engine idling with a deep thrum. The other vehicles took up flanking positions, effectively, if unintentionally, cordoning off one side of the square. Officer Miller and Officer Davies froze mid-stance, their bravado and nervousness respectively, instantly replaced by wide-eyed astonishment. This was Harmony Creek, not a war zone. The sudden, formidable military presence was inexplicable, almost surreal. The rear door of the command Humvee opened, and a figure emerged, stepping out with an air of crisp, no-nonsense authority. Colonel Eva Ramirez, her uniform impeccably pressed, adorned with an array of ribbons and insignia that spoke of a long and distinguished career, surveyed the scene with a sharp, intelligent gaze. Her eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the startled officers, the anxious protesters, and then they stopped. They locked onto the unassuming figure of Elias Thorne, standing quietly with his dog. Colonel Ramirez's stern, professional demeanor visibly faltered for the briefest of moments. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of disbelief swiftly followed by an expression of profound, almost shocked respect. She ignored Officer Miller, who had instinctively straightened up, his hand hovering near his belt as if unsure of the correct protocol. She ignored the gasps and murmurs from the assembled crowd. Her entire focus narrowed onto Elias. With measured, purposeful strides she crossed the distance, her boots clicking sharply on the pavement, a stark contrast to Elias's worn soles. She came to a precise parade ground halt directly in front of Elias and Duke, her posture radiating command. "Sergeant Major Thorne?" she asked, her voice clear and carrying, imbued with the natural authority of her rank, yet undeniably softened by a note of something akin to reverence. a deep underlying emotion that resonated with those close enough to hear. Elias Thorne, the quiet old man, met her gaze. A faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his own eyes. A flicker of recognition. He inclined his head slightly. "Colonel Ramirez," he acknowledged, his voice still quiet but steady. "It has indeed been a very long time." What happened? Next sent a wave of stunned silence through the square. Colonel Ava Ramirez, a full-bird colonel in the United States Army National Guard, snapped to attention, her back ramrod straight, and executed a salute so sharp, so perfect, it seemed to vibrate in the air. "Sir," she declared, her voice ringing with genuine, unadulterated respect, "it is an honor, an unexpected honor, to see you again." The handful of National Guard soldiers who had disembarked from the other vehicles, initially looking around with mild curiosity, now froze. They watched, dumbfounded, as their commanding officer rendered a salute of such profound deference to an elderly man in civilian clothes, a man who looked like he'd seen better days, accompanied by a golden retriever. Confusion warred with dawning understanding on their faces as they too began to straighten their postures, a ripple of military discipline spreading through their ranks. Officer Miller, completely bewildered by this turn of events, his earlier arrogance deflating, like a punctured balloon, finally managed to stammer, "Colonel, ma'am, this man, he was causing a disturbance. His animal was aggressive." He gestured vaguely toward Elias, his confidence visibly crumbling under Ramirez's steely gaze. Colonel Ramirez didn't even glance at him. Her eyes, cold as chips of ice, remained fixed on Miller. "Officer," she began, her voice dangerously low and controlled, "do you have any conceivable idea who this man is?" She didn't pause for his stuttered, inadequate response. Her voice rose, filled with a passionate, righteous anger that seemed to make the air crackle. "This," she declared, her hand gesturing toward Elias, who stood with quiet dignity, "Duke, now sitting calmly at his feet, is Sergeant Major Elias Thorne. Call sign, Ghost. The man who, against all odds, held the line at Firebase Nightingale for 3 days with a skeleton crew and half his platoon wounded when High Command had already written them off as lost. The man who personally volunteered and led the clandestine rescue of the entirety of Echo Company, 1001st Airborne, when they were trapped, surrounded, and out of ammunition during Operation Desert Viper, navigating them through 20 miles of hostile territory with 0 casualties. This is the man who taught an entire generation of Special Forces operators, myself included, the true meaning of courage, sacrifice, leadership, and unwavering dedication to his soldiers. Her voice, raw with emotion and fierce pride, resonated. Across the square, silencing every whisper, every rustle of leaves, the protesters stared, mouths agape, a collective wave of awe washing over them. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Ramirez then slowly lowered her gaze to Duke, who looked up at her with trusting eyes. Then, significantly, to Officer Miller's polished boot, her expression hardening into one of utter contempt. And, "You?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You kicked his service dog?" Officer Miller's face, already pale, drained of all remaining color, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. He looked as if he might be physically ill. Officer Davies, standing slightly behind him, visibly flinched and looked down at the ground, his shame palpable. The crowd, processing the colonel's words, let out a collective murmur, no longer just of awe for Elias, but of profound, gathering anger directed at Miller. "I received an urgent communication," Colonel Ramirez continued, her voice returning to a more official, yet still icy tone, "from a very concerned, very highly placed old friend on the governor's personal staff. He mentioned there might be a delicate situation unfolding at this protest, potentially involving a highly decorated veteran being mistreated. I didn't for one moment imagine it was the Ghost." She gestured briefly to her assembled troops, who now stood rigidly at attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and immense respect for the old man before them. We were en route to a statewide joint training exercise. However, she stated, her eyes boring into Miller, this situation clearly takes precedence over any drill. She turned back to the disgraced officer. Your chief of police will be hearing about this incident within the hour, officer. So will the mayor. And, believe me, so will the governor's office. This is not how we treat our citizens. This is certainly not how we treat our veterans. And this, her voice quivered with barely suppressed fury, is unequivocally not how we treat a national hero, a man to whom this entire nation owes an unpayable, immeasurable debt of gratitude. Officer Miller stood frozen, his face a mask of dawning horror and utter humiliation. Words failed him. Only a series of incoherent, sputtering sounds escaped his lips as he tried to formulate an apology, a justification, anything. I didn't know, sir, ma'am. Colonel, he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Ramirez and Elias, seeking an escape that clearly wasn't there. Officer Davies looked utterly mortified, his gaze fixed on his own boots as if hoping the ground would swallow him whole. He seemed to shrink under the weight of the collective disapproval. Elias, ever uncomfortable with being the center of attention despite the gravity of the situation, shifted slightly. He placed a reassuring hand on Duke's head. It's quite all right, Colonel Ramirez, he said, his voice soft but clear, carrying a weariness that was more about the unwanted fuss than his own indignation. Duke will be fine. He's a tough old soldier himself. He then looked toward the small, unassuming building that housed the Veteran Support Center. We just want the center to stay open. It means a lot to many of us. Colonel Ramirez's stern expression softened considerably as she turned back to Elias. A flicker of the deep respect, and perhaps even affection, she held for her former mentor shone in her eyes. We'll do more than see about that, Sergeant. Major, she said, her voice now firm with resolve, I have a strong feeling your voice and your story will carry significantly more weight in certain offices now. She cast a pointed glance toward the distant edifice of the Harmony Creek Town Hall. Perhaps a direct conversation with the mayor is in order, and I believe, she added, a ghost of a smile touching her lips as she looked at her assembled troops, you'll have some rather compelling support during that conversation. The other veterans at the protest, men and women who had known Elias only as a quiet, unassuming compatriot, now looked at him with a mixture of astonishment, awe, and fierce pride. One elderly man, his own service ribbons faded on his VFW, Cap slowly, reverently, raised his hand in a shaky salute toward Elias. Others murmured words of support, offering quiet pats on his shoulder, their eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude and vindication. Colonel Ramirez then turned her attention back to the disgraced officers. Officer Miller, Officer Davies, she commanded, her voice devoid of any warmth, you will secure the perimeter on the far side of the square and await further instructions from your superiors. Do not interfere further. Am I understood? Both officers, thoroughly humbled, could only nod dumbly and shuffle away, the weight of their public disgrace heavy on their shoulders. Miller's swagger was entirely gone, replaced by a defeated slump. Davies cast one last apologetic glance toward Elias before following his partner into their self-imposed exile. As Colonel Ramirez recounted Sergeant Major Thorne's almost mythical exploits, Fire-Base Nightingale, Operation Desert Viper. For a fleeting moment, Elias's vision blurred. It wasn't age, but memory, the acrid smell of cordite, the percussive roar of artillery, the faces of young men, barely more than boys, looking to him for guidance, for survival. He saw again the desperate, exhausted eyes of the soldiers from Echo Company as he led them through the moonless night. Duke's much younger predecessor, a black Labrador named Shadow, scouting silently ahead. These weren't just stories Ramirez was telling. They were chapters of his life, etched into his soul with the indelible ink of sacrifice and loss. When Ramirez mentioned teaching a generation of special forces, Elias saw her face, younger, fiercely determined, struggling through a brutal SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, training exercise he had overseen decades ago. A flicker of a grim, shared understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the crucible that had forged them both. Duke, sensitive to his master's subtle shift in emotion, pressed his head firmly against Elias's leg, a warm, grounding presence that pulled him back from the precipice of memory to the reality of the sun-dappled square. The weight of those memories, usually a crushing burden, felt strangely lighter today, validated not by the accolades, but by the simple, profound respect in the eyes of a fellow soldier and the unexpected support of his community. The past was not forgotten, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel quite so lonely. The ghosts of his past, always present, seemed to stand a little straighter, their spectral forms nodding in approval. This small victory, this unexpected intervention, wasn't just about a community center. It was about affirming that their sacrifices, their stories, still mattered. The ripples of that afternoon in Harmony Creek spread far and wide. Elias Thorne, the quiet veteran, was suddenly, and much to his discomfort, a local hero once more, his story whispered with reverence. Officer Miller faced a formal investigation, swift disciplinary action, and mandatory retraining in de-escalation, community relations, and veteran sensitivity. His career in Harmony Creek was, for all intents and purposes, irrevocably tarnished. Officer Davies, profoundly shaken and deeply ashamed by his own inaction, voluntarily requested a transfer to a different precinct after completing several courses, on his own initiative, including one on understanding the role of service animals. He later wrote a heartfelt, anonymous letter of apology that found its way to Elias via Colonel Ramirez. As for the Veteran Support Center, its future was no longer in doubt, fueled by public outcry and the direct, formidable intervention of Colonel Ramirez, who personally met with the mayor and the town council, flanked by several high-ranking National Guard officers and, subtly, a representative from the governor's office. Its funding was not only reinstated, but significantly increased. Plans were drawn up for expansion, for new programs, for better outreach. It became a beacon of how a community could and should honor its veterans. The incident served as a potent, almost painful reminder to Harmony Creek and beyond. Never judge a book by its cover, for the most unassuming bindings can hold the most extraordinary tales. The quietest souls, those who walk amongst us without fanfare, often carry the loudest, most profound histories of courage, resilience, and selfless sacrifice. True respect, the kind that resonates deep in the human spirit, is not commanded by a uniform or a title alone, nor by outward appearances of strength or status. It is earned by unwavering character and quiet, often hidden, acts of profound integrity and service. The worth of an individual is not diminished by age, by faded clothes, or by the visible scars of a life hard lived. Often these are the very indicators of a spirit tested and found true. Weeks later, the golden hues of late autumn painted Harmony Creek in a softer light. Elias Thorne and Duke, now familiar and respected figures, took their usual afternoon walk through the town square. There was a subtle difference in the air, in the way people met Elias's gaze, nods of acknowledgement, quiet smiles. A deferential space made for them on the sidewalks. Young Officer Davies, back on a temporary assignment in Harmony Creek before. His transfer was walking his beat. He saw Elias and Duke approaching, and his step faltered for a moment. Then, with a newfound humility in his eyes, he stopped, his posture respectful but not servile. "Sergeant Major Thorne, sir," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He offered a small, genuine nod to both Elias, and then, with a hesitant smile, to Duke. "It's good to see you both looking well. I heard the center is thriving. They're doing great work there." Elias, who had expected perhaps an awkward silence, was touched by the young man's sincerity. He offered a rare, warm smile that reached his tired eyes, crinkling the corners. "Thank you, Officer Davies." "It is. And Duke is much better. Thank you for asking." Duke, as if understanding, let out a soft woof and wagged his tail, even nudging Davies's outstretched hand tentatively. A small moment of connection, of healing, in the crisp autumn air. The encounter was brief, but it spoke volumes about the changes, both seen and unseen, that had rippled through the town. The wound inflicted that day was mending, not just for Duke's bruised ribs, but for a community reminded of its core values, of compassion, and of the quiet dignity of those who had given so much. Elias continued his walk, Duke trotting happily beside him. The late afternoon sun cast their long shadows, symbols of enduring strength and the quiet power of respect, finally given and received. True heroes, the ones who shape our world with their courage and sacrifice, often walk among us cloaked. In humility, their greatness unseen, their stories unheard, until a moment of truth reveals them. They seek no parades, no accolades, only the quiet peace of a life lived with honor. If you believe in the enduring power of such quiet strength, if you believe that every individual, regardless of appearance, deserves our deepest respect, and if you stand for honoring the sacrifices of those who have served, then subscribe to Hidden Sparks. Our mission is to bring these hidden stories into the light, to ensure that courage is recognized and valor is never forgotten. Share this story if it moved you, if it reminded you of the silent giants who walk among us.